Good day everyone and welcome to this somewhat delayed analysis video, where we will be talking about the trailer for The Last of Us Part 2. I was originally gonna do this video back in December, just after the trailer had dropped, but, sometimes life just happens. Still, better late than never. Before we get started, I want to point out that this analysis is going to assume that you're familiar with the first game and its story. Many plot points will be spoiled, including the ending, so if you intended to play the first one before tackling the sequel, I would suggest you do that first before proceeding with this video. If you have no intention of playing it, or you aren't able for whatever reason, then I would refer you to my videos where I summarize the story. I believe they will give you the context you need to follow along in the discussion in this video, so I'm putting up an annotation to the first one right now. So yeah, a massive spoiler alert, just wanted to get that out of the way before I accidentally ruin someone's day. Now, onto the still slightly bewildering fact that we actually got a trailer for a sequel to The Last of Us. I was honestly a bit surprised. Pleasantly surprised, but surprised nonetheless. It really reinvigorated my passion and interest for the series, and judging by my YouTube stats, I wasn't the only one. That made me even more excited to talk about this series again, and from that excitement, the idea for this video was born. This video will be structured as follows. We'll start with my brief impressions of the trailer itself, and then we'll move on to the main analysis. The analysis will focus on 7 key aspects from the trailer, more about them when we get to it. After that, I'll speculate on what the possible story scenarios for the sequel may be, and then I'll close the video out by giving you my thoughts on there actually being a sequel. And with all of that out of the way, let's get to it. First off, what did I think of the trailer as a whole? I really liked it, and I think it did a great job of gradually revealing several narrative aspects. How we go from the forest to gradually reveal the town, how we see more of Ellie, how Joel is introduced, and finally the little story bits that we get towards the end. Aside from revealing the game, however, we really don't get that much information. The only hard facts we learn is that the game takes place after the first one, that it will star Joel and Ellie, and that Ellie's really pissed about something. Even so, there is more than enough here for a bit of speculation, which we will get to in just a minute. Overall, I think the trailer works really well as a teaser, as well as an introduction to planting the idea that The Last of Us is actually getting a sequel. I was thoroughly expecting that we would get some more information at this year's E3, but as Naughty Dog made clear, they wanted the focus to be on Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, which I completely understand given the circumstance. If you had that game and The Last of Us Part 2 competing for attention, then any buzz surrounding The Lost Legacy would be completely drowned out. We will probably get some more information at this year's PSX, so that gives us a few more months to speculate with what we have. There are 7 aspects of the trailer that I will be focusing on. The state of the world itself, the Firefly logo on the stop sign, Ellie's trembling hand, her tattoo, the house itself, the line "you're really gonna go through with this?" and finally the identity of the them that Ellie speaks of. Something that I'll not go in depth on is the song that Ellie sings. I don't think it's more complicated than that it indicates that she's going down a really dark path. I don't think there's much more meaning to infer from it, but hey, what do I know? Could be that it holds the key to some major plot point, but it's still not something that I'll be discussing in this video at least. With that said, let's get dissecting. First, let's talk about the world and the state it appears to be in. The first thing to notice is that the buildings appear to be more overgrown than they were in the first game. That makes complete sense as we're a couple of years further down the timeline, and nature, such as it is, has started reclaiming more and more of civilization. Something to think about though is what this would do for transportation and migration. As you may have noticed, there is a major element to The Last of Us that is completely absent from this trailer: the infected. It's possible that it's now easier for humans to find isolated settlements now that it's harder to get to them. That would also go for the infected, because while they may not be stopped by more savage terrain, it would slow them down significantly. That said though, I don't think it's a particularly likely scenario. In the first game, 20 years passed between the prologue and the main game, and during that time span they didn't really seem to slow down due to nature or, well, anything else. So I think it's as simple as the infected were not a main focal point for this trailer. Regardless though, from what we see in this trailer, civilization is nowhere near getting back on its feet. In fact, it seems to be doing worse than ever. Suffice to say, I don't think any reclamation campaigns have been launched. In other words, I don't think we can expect any major changes regarding the setting. Also, while we're on this frame, let's talk about the Firefly logo on the stop sign. Its placement could just be a coincidence, but it could also be an indication that the Fireflies will be playing the role of the villain in the game. By that I just mean that, well, it's on a stop sign, so that could indicate that the Fireflies are the ones that need to be stopped. It is possible, of course, that this is just a coincidence. After all, stop signs are a fairly common occurrence, and they needed to put the logo on something. It is obviously very little to go on at this point, but I would still say that this could count as an indication as to the Fireflies being an antagonist. That's a topic we'll come back to a little later. Next, let's move on to our first shot of the now adult Ellie and her trembling hand. This trembling is very deliberately shown, so I'm going to assume that it has some sort of relevance to the overall story. The question we need to ask ourselves is, of course, why? Why is her hand trembling? In the panel following the initial reveal of the trailer, Ashley Johnson, the actress portraying Ellie, said, and I quote, "She's been through some shit." This can of course indicate a number of things. Could it be the long-term effect of some injury she sustained in a battle? Could it be the result of some kind of emotional trauma? Or could this have something to do with her immunity to the infection? After all, she does have a fungal mass growing all over her brain. While it prevents her from turning into one of the infected, we don't know what long-term effects it will have on her brain and her body. It's quite possible that this trembling is the result of the fungus messing around with her nervous system. Personally, I think that's a highly possible scenario. After all, she went through a fair bit in both the main game and in Left Behind, and at no point did we see any of that stress manifest itself physiologically. That said though, it's possible that it's taken a few years for that trauma to catch up with her. As such, these symptoms are only now starting to manifest. It is of course also very possible that something really bad happened in between games. Whatever that event might have been, it is highly possible that it's responsible for triggering both Ellie's rage and her trembling. In my heart of hearts, I know that is probably the more logical explanation, but I'm still hoping for the fungal aspect. I just think it would be more interesting. It would make Ellie's immunity a bit more complicated, as well as open up the venue to explore her feelings on her condition. As I said though, I think the trembling is most likely caused by emotional trauma, but hey, one can dream. The shot of Ellie's hand also brings us to our next point of discussion, her tattoo. While it is kind of hard to make out the details from the trailer alone, Naughty Dog were kind enough to provide us with a more detailed image, which was released for cosplaying purposes. As we can see, it depicts a butterfly and two branches from two different plants. The first question I wanted to address is, what are these plants? When it comes to botany, my knowledge is very limited. However, I do know some people who know a bit or two about it, and that would be my parents. They were a bit uncertain of the lower one, especially since it's not that detailed. They think it might be some variation of horsetail, but it's kind of hard to say. They were able to identify the upper one though. It is some variation of fern. The fern and the butterfly are in my opinion the most interesting parts of this tattoo, as they both lend themselves well to a symbolic reading. Now, finding reliable information about symbolism on the internet is, well, it's a lot harder than I thought it would be. There are about as many interpretations as there are websites, and some of them don't exactly look all that reliable. I was able to find some that seemed generally agreed upon, but even so, take these readings with a pinch of salt. Starting with the fern, it has been used as a symbol for sincerity towards others. It has also been interpreted as a symbol for confidence, shelter, and discretion. Personally, all of these are things that I associate to Ellie in the first game. Following Tess's death, she was very open and sincere with Joel, even though he did not respond in kind, at least not initially. This goes for her attitude towards several other characters as well, like Sam and Maria. In other words, it seems to represent her initial character very well. She is of course a bit more reserved after the winter chapter. She's gone through some changes, which neatly brings us over to the butterfly. Now, the butterfly has like a billion things associated with it, but the one that seems to be most reoccurring is transformation or metamorphosis. This reading would line up very well with what Neil Druckmann said would be the main focus of this story. He said that if the first game was about trust and growing relationships, this one will be about hate. If we take that into account, we may have a possible reading of Ellie's tattoo. The fern represents who she used to be, and how her and Joel's relationship grew as they traveled together. This leads directly into the butterfly, which represents her transforming and changing.
While butterfly transformations are usually associated with very positive characteristics, that's not necessarily a given. It could be that her transformation leaves her angry, bitter, and hateful. Now, if you'll indulge me, let me present a theory about how this butterfly metaphor could apply to her character as a whole. The first part of the first game is her caterpillar phase. She's younger, more naive, more trusting, and more eager to form relationships. Then comes the winter chapter, which sends her into her cocoon phase. She's now more closed, sheltered, and docile. I would argue that she's still in this state when the game ends. Whatever happens in between games forces her out of her cocoon, forces her to emerge as somewhat of a dark butterfly. She's now angrier, more vengeful, and of course, more prone to hate, and she can never go back, because the Ellie she was when she was a caterpillar no longer exists. I know that this is a lot to conclude from just one picture and a few comments, but I really think it fits. I just really wish I knew what the lower branch represented, but for now I guess we'll have to do without it. Even so, I believe that there is information to be gained from studying this tattoo. They wouldn't have made a thing of showing it otherwise. I really believe that it gives us some insight into Ellie's development as a character and the darker path she's now walking. It remains to be seen if this reading of mine is correct, and if it's not, I'm very curious to see what this tattoo is meant to represent. It will have some significance though, that I am completely sure of. Moving on, let's briefly touch on the house itself. We don't really get any indication of the house's proximity to the environments we're shown at the beginning of the trailer. If we do assume that they're close together, this could potentially be a Firefly Hideout or safe house. If it is, we can probably assume that it's fairly remote. Again, we don't see any indication that there are infected in the area. If this is indeed a Firefly Hideout, that would lend further credence to the idea that Ellie came here to kill them. Given the state that Ellie is in, and the fact that she was alone, Joel only seems to show up after the killing's been done, it's fairly safe to assume that she succeeded. It is of course possible that the dead people are not Fireflies at all, but rather people who came there to kill the house's previous owners, that possibly being Fireflies. Ellie could then have arrived to avenge them. Either way, I think it's fairly reasonable to assume that she's the one responsible for all the corpses strewn about. I'll come back to this in just a bit when I talk about possible story scenarios. Next, let's talk about a line from Joel when he says, "You really going through with this?" This seems to indicate that whatever Ellie is doing, it's something that they've discussed and considered before. Whatever this is, it's possible that it's something that she was talked out of doing at some point, but whatever's happened now has resulted in her deciding to go through with it. Whatever led her to reach this conclusion, I'm willing to bet that it has something to do with all the dead people in that house. Either they were killed by her, or she feels that they were killed unjustly. Either way, she certainly seems to have made up her mind. I don't get the feeling that Joel is necessarily opposed to this plan, but that he rather wants to make sure that she knows what she's doing. There is an air of finality to it though. I get the feeling that no matter what they're about to do, it will in some way change their lives forever. I don't necessarily think it's something as drastic as a suicide mission, but whatever standing they currently have in the world, they're about to give it up. Since Ellie says that she's going to kill every single one of them, I assume she has some kind of hit list in mind. Who end up being on that list still remains to be seen. And that neatly leads us in to our final point of trailer speculation. Who are the them that Ellie intends to kill? If my previous speculations are correct, then I would say that the most likely candidates are the Fireflies. Since their logo is one of the first things we see in the trailer, I think it's very safe to assume that they will play some part in this story. As things stand by the end of the first game, they're also the ones most likely to carry some kind of grudge. Them and Joel in particular didn't exactly part on the best of terms, so they have all the motivation they need to come after them. If they're indeed out for blood, then their response could be what triggered Ellie to decide that they all need to be killed. I think something like that would make the most sense because, aside from the Fireflies, there really aren't that many other factions that we know about. I really don't think that she's talking about the infected, because killing all of them, that would be quite the undertaking. Also, the infected aren't really an organization, they're more just part of the world at this point. There are of course the hunters, but they don't seem to be much of an organized faction either. In fact, I think they're independently operating groups. It could of course be one of these groups that Ellie's going to war with, but honestly I think that's a bit boring. I think it would be far more satisfying to introduce the Fireflies as an antagonist rather than an, up until this point, unnamed group. It could of course also be remnants from David's group, but honestly I don't think they're in any shape to cause any kind of significant damage. Also, the thing that made them the most interesting was David himself, and with him gone, I really don't see any need to bring them back. The final candidate that I could see would be the military. It could be that they've started attacking unregulated settlements, including the one where Joel and Ellie are holed up, wherever that might be. Once again though, I don't think that this is a very likely scenario. After all, they would probably be busy maintaining the few zones that they actually control. In other words, they're in no shape to start going on the offensive. So yeah, based on what we know now, my money's on the Fireflies. There is of course always the possibility that they will come up with some brand new villain, but for now, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, there isn't that much more we can get from the trailer itself, but that doesn't prevent us from speculating a little further. Let's take the information we have and try to come up with some possible scenarios for The Last of Us Part 2. The first one is one that I think is fairly plausible, but it's also one that I would call a bit straightforward. In this scenario, Joel and Ellie head to Tommy and Maria's town to try to settle down. After some time, the Fireflies attack the town, seeking vengeance for Marlene. The house we see in the trailer is part of Tommy and Maria's settlement, and the carnage we see is the aftermath of the battle. It's even possible that the house belongs to someone Joel and Ellie knew. Having dealt with the aggressors, Ellie sentimentally picks up the guitar that belonged to the house's previous owner and plays a song that they were fond of. Joel arrives and asks her what she's doing, where she declares that it's now time to take the Fireflies head on. Again, as I said, this is a fairly straightforward scenario, but I wouldn't be too surprised if whatever they're going with contains some of these elements, or at least some variation of them. The second scenario I would like to propose relies a bit more heavily on the final act of the first game. Here, Ellie finds out what the Fireflies intended to do to her while she was under, and she feels betrayed. Perhaps not by the plan itself, again I've speculated that she may very well be on board with it, but rather that she was never given a chance to decide on whether or not she wanted to sacrifice her life. Years later, she started hunting down Firefly cells to probe them for information. What we see in the trailer is the result of such an interrogation. She now has all the information she needs to get on with her plan to exterminate the Fireflies. While this certainly would fit the hate motif, I am fairly certain that this is not something that they will be going with. My reasoning for that? Weak motivation. While Ellie has all the reason in the world to be a bit cross with the Fireflies, I don't think that this would be her immediate response. There is her relationship to Marlene, Marlene's relationship to Ellie's mother's relationship to the organization, and so on. Plus it feels a bit forced and inelegant, and inelegance is not something this series is known for when it comes to storytelling. So yeah, this one I find very unlikely. The third I'd like to propose is a variation of the first one. Here, it's become more widely known that Ellie's immune, and also that her immunity could potentially lead to a vaccine. Now there are several groups out to capture her, including the remnants of the Fireflies, and they're quite relentless in their search. From here, it's the same story as the first scenario, where they attack wherever Joel and Ellie are living, and their loved ones become collateral damage. Because of the attack, Ellie decides to go on the offensive. As for the likelihood of this one, I really don't know. It all depends on how they want to handle Ellie and her immunity. What would make sense is her anger being triggered by innocents getting hurt by people trying to get to her. That would be more in line with her character, especially if she's now older and more prone to hate. We'll just have to wait and see for now then. And finally, let's talk about a scenario that I didn't think of, but rather one that I've seen floating around. That would be the proposition that Joel is now dead. The Joel we see in the trailer is nothing more than a figment of Ellie's imagination, and she is about to set out on a killing spree to avenge him. This theory is based on... well, I don't really know. Supposedly it was because people found Joel's walk a little... ghosty, I guess? And that Ellie could only be this upset if Joel was the one who got killed. Out of all the scenarios I've discussed up until this point, this is the one I find by far to be the least likely. If you think about it, this would mean that Joel, as an independent character, would not be in the game. To the extent that he would be there at all, he would be a part of Ellie's mind. As such, he would not be able to affect the world, he would only be able to talk to Ellie, and he would not be able to grow as a character. I mean, can you imagine that? A The Last of Us game where Joel isn't his own person. It would be such a monumental waste, and adding to that is that the whole mind ghost trope is really tired at this point. Neil Druckmann, the author of the story and the creative director for the first game, said that they explored several different ideas for how a sequel could be structured, having it be a prequel, using different characters and stuff like that, but that it always came back to Joel and Ellie. Going through all of that only to have one of the characters being dead from the very beginning? No, I am convinced that he and the other writers can do way better. Ultimately though, it's impossible to say what scenario they'll be going with at this time, so we'll just have to patiently wait for the next info dump. Still, it's always fun to speculate. Now, before I wrap this up, I'd like to briefly talk about the fact that The Last of Us is actually getting a sequel and how I personally feel about that. I still stand by what I said at the end of the 4th episode of the in-depth analysis, in that I'd rather they didn't make a sequel, but if they were to make one, I'll fully embrace it. By that I mean that I don't think this story necessarily needs a continuation. I think it conveys what it sets out to convey, and I think it ends right where it needed to end. The ending is clear enough that you know what actually happened, but still vague enough to invite speculation and discussion. As such, I think it would have worked absolutely fine as a self-contained story. Continuing it also risks compromising the first game's ending, in that we will probably get an answer to how Ellie interpreted Joel's lie at the very end. With that said though, I would be 100% lying if I said that I wasn't curious to find out what happened after the first game's ending. I am of course also dying to return to this universe, as I find it extremely compelling and so interesting to explore. With that said, it would have felt so weird to return to this world without Joel and Ellie. They are so deeply interwoven with what made the first game as good as it was and as interesting as it was. If you think about it, the whole world and apocalypse was basically just a backdrop for their relationship to evolve, so to leave them behind would not only feel weird, it would feel like a wasted opportunity. So, I very much agree with what Neil Druckmann said. A sequel to The Last of Us can't be about anything else but Joel and Ellie. I still maintain my original point, that the first game would have worked fine as a standalone experience, and that I'm concerned about how this sequel may affect our interpretation of it, yet at the same time I am super excited to see that we're actually getting a continuation. Also, the concern of how a sequel may affect our interpretation of the first game is one that the development team seems very much aware of. During the previously mentioned panel, Neil Druckmann said that these are concerns that he too shares, but he also asks us, as fans, to trust him and the team. When he puts it like that, and really shows that he knows what fans are concerned about, then I can't help but feel that this project is in very good hands. He asks us to trust them, and I'm more than happy to do so. I still maintain that a sequel isn't entirely necessary, but from what we've been shown so far, it seems that we're getting a sequel that honors the first game, not only as a great video game and a good piece of storytelling, but also as a cultural phenomenon. Am I concerned about what a sequel means for the series as a whole? Of course I am. I'm concerned for every sequel. There is always the risk that a sequel in one way or another will disappoint, which is why I try to avoid getting too hyped for anything these days. But with The Last of Us Part 2, I have to say that I remain very hopeful. More so than anything, I am really excited to see where this goes. And that is gonna do it for this one. Thank you ever so much for watching. I intend to stay a bit more on the ball covering news about this game going forward, and I assume we're getting our next info dump at PSX, so you won't have to wait 10 months for a video about whatever gets said there. Regarding video output, my current ambition is to try to launch 2 videos a month. That is not a promise, obviously, but rather an ambition, so we'll have to see how that goes. Also, if the audio is a bit all over the place in this video, my apologies. I've been experimenting with new setups for recording the voiceovers. I'm trying to get away from huddling under a blanket, which is very warm and very uncomfortable, and I think I found one that works pretty well. Took me a while to get there though, so you may have heard some remnants from previous setups in this video. Also, in between takes, I caught a cold, so if you hear my voice sounding a bit different between segments, then that is probably why. Anyway, it's about time to wrap this up. If you enjoyed this video, you're more than welcome to hit the subscribe button, and I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day. Until next time, take care everyone.